And welcome, Wargamer. Welcome back to the next episode in our series of Mastering Mass Combat for fantasy role-playing games. Today, the RPG Sage and I will be reviewing Birthright, Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition setting that has two different methodologies for managing mass combat. One is for skirmish scale battles of 100 or 200 or so on each side, and the other is for larger battle. Basically, we're going to continue to use the scenario put forth by Mr. Wargaming for his proof of concept episode, which the link will be in the description below if you want to check that out if you haven't seen it already. Basically, the scenario is a group of cavalry is on a mission to rescue a bunch of human prisoners from a group of orcs. And there are 160 of these light cavalry, and there are 120 of the orcs, leading the prisoners off to the north to be consumed by a giant. So what we're going to do is fight out this battle using the skirmish rules, and we will do another episode a bit later using the full-scale war rules, and we'll come up with another scenario for that, which what we'll do is in these ongoing episodes, we'll continue to use the same scenario format so that we can get a good idea of how this will work. So, RPG Sage, tell us a little bit more about the Birthright setting and its methodology.
I'd be delighted to. Thanks for having me on. So Birthright is a campaign setting for 2nd edition D&D, and the basic premise is, what if we gave everybody domains at first level? And it is the only 2nd edition rule set that aggressively, concretely, thoroughly describes domain management in the context of 2nd edition, or even in 1st edition rules, since 1st and 2nd edition are pretty similar. And it opens up domain level play to even 1st level characters, kind of catapulting the campaign into the domain play stage. And the Birthright has, as you said, two mass combat systems. The first mass combat is for skirmishes, which is anything less than 200 per side. If you're over 200 per side, you should be using the war card system, the subject of a future video. So today we have the standard Mr. Wargaming scenario broken down, and we're going to talk about why we chose the stats we did and what effect that's going to have.
So for the cavalry, we have 160 light cavalry led by a hero, and we're going to assume the hero is level 4, and the light cavalry are all level 1.
Right.
According to the rules for setting up the skirmish, we're going to basically take a look at their 2nd edition stats for Thaco versus armor class and determine what their attack roll is. We're also going to go ahead and use the weapon versus armor class modifiers for 2nd edition, which have to do with your slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning weapons. And we'll apply that to the various armor classes of the orcs and the cavalry and come up with attack rolls, damage rolls. Then we'll go ahead and lay out the map and fight this battle.
Sounds good. So the first thing to do when fighting a Birthright skirmish is break your forces up into 20 individuals, 20 creatures per group. And these groups then fight. If you don't have enough to make a full group of 20, you can make a group of 10 and it'll just do half damage. The second thing you do is you total up the number of hit dice in that group. So if you have a group of 20 first level humans, that's 1 hit die. So they have a total of 20 hit dice. If you have 20 orcs, that's 20 hit dice. If you have 20 gnolls, that's 40 hit dice. That's going to represent the total sustainable hits by that group. And we may as well just stick with hit dice. The second thing to do is figure out the total damage that you do. And here we're going to have to include the weapon versus armor modifiers. What's the armor class of the enemy? What weapons are they using? And critically, for skirmish rules, absolutely everything about normal man-to-man combat in 2nd edition applies. All of the rules that you're familiar with, skirmishes only present a simplified mechanic for dealing damage and absorbing damage. We look and we say that the light cavalry are fighter 1, so they have a Thaco of 20. They're wearing leather and shield, which per AD&D 2 is AC 7. They're armed with light lances, which do 1d6 damage, and footmen's maces, which do 1d6 damage. Sir Dude, our hero, is in a slightly different situation, but because he's just one man, his biggest contribution to his group is by increasing its hit dice. He has 4 hit dice. He's got Chainmail and Shield, Light Lance, Footman's Mace. So his group is going to have 24 hit dice. All the other cavalry are going to have 20.
Right, and his particular group will actually be 21 models.
Right, but there's some fudge factor in how many models, if you want to use the wargaming term, how many models should be in each group. For instance, the 125 orcs don't break down cleanly into groups of 10 or 20, but they work real well if you break them down into groups of 20. Say that the 5 extra are sub-chiefs, and assign that extra sub-chief to certain groups and be done with.
Right, so basically each of the orc groups will be 21 models as well, or 21 individuals. I keep saying models, you keep saying models, and I will say this every day, that this is a war game. So whether you're just playing basic Dungeons and Dragons or you're including mass combat or not, I think to me it's still a war game.
I think that's fine. It can be a war game. So we'll say models.
So the orcs, they're armed with spears or halberds or crossbows, and they're wearing chainmail, so that's going to give them AC 5. So the cavalry will have an attack roll of 15, right? Thaco of 20 minus 5 is 15.
Correct.
Bonuses for charging and being mounted.
Yeah. So their Thaco is 20. So their normal to hit number is then 15 for chain, 14 because they're mounted attacking people on foot, 12 at least in the first round because they're charging. So Birthright skirmish rules say figure out the 2 hit number and then subtract that from 20, and that's the number of hits that each group scores per round. So each hit is 1 hit die of damage. So we can then say that the base damage of the cavalry, they're going to do 8 hits base damage if they're charging with their lances. And then some people are going to resolve this differently. Some DMs may say, okay, there's enough room for the lancers to wheel around and come in for another charge. Well, that's just going to be another 8 base damage. Alternatively, you might say, well, you're stuck in the melee now, and now you need to switch over to your melee weapon, which is the mace, and that changes the computation a little bit. It improves their weapon versus armor, because maces versus chainmail get a +2 to hit, but they lose the charge bonus. That ends up being a wash. So they're going to do 8 base damage when they charge with lances. They're going to do 8 base damage if they're not charging and they're using their maces. And if any of them get dismounted for any reason, then their bonus for being mounted against footmen goes away, and they drop down to 7 base hits.
Correct. And the only other thing to remember is that because of the charge, though, they get to do double damage on that first round when they're charging. So the 8 base hits will actually count as 16.
So then we do the same thing in the orcs. We break them up into groups of 20, and that works out really cleanly. We then have 3 groups of 20 spear orcs, 1 group of 20 crossbow orcs, 2 groups of 20 halberd orcs, and distribute them around the prisoners for the scenario. And we put the orc leader, Orcus Porcus, in the front with the crossbowmen, and the halberds and spears around the sides and back of the prisoner column. And their base damage works out similarly. As orcs, their Thaco is 19. They're attacking men in leather and shield, which is 7. So 19 minus 7 becomes 12. They get a -2 for their, or I should say a +2 to hit bonus for their weapon versus armor, piercing versus leather. They then suffer penalties. -1 to hit because they are dismounted attacking mounted riders, and -1 to hit because the weather today is clear and sunny. How do we know that? Well, we consulted the table, and I have an almanac of weather. We figured out what the rough climate model should be for Mr. Wargaming's fight, and we looked it up, and it says that on July 11th, it'll be 90 degrees, clear, sunny, with a strong northerly wind. So those poor orcs are fighting at a disadvantage here. That's going to mean, all told, that the orcs do a base damage of 8 hits per round, 9 hits if they're fighting anybody dismounted, and 9 hits for the crossbows, because they don't suffer the penalty for fighting mounted troops, because they're missileers. There's one of the things we need to consider for the orcs. They are armed with halberds and spears, which are polearm weapons. And per TUI rules, you can set a spear or a polearm against an anticipated charge. And if you do that, you can do double damage. And people who are charging suffer a -1 AC penalty, and they don't get dex bonuses. But we're assuming that all of the men have bog standard stats anyway. So the men, when they're charging, become easier to hit. That's going to increase the base damage that the orcs do against them. So the orcs' base damage is 9 if they're being charged, or 8 otherwise. 9 if they become dismounted. 9 for crossbows, or 10 if they're being charged. And it's easier to figure all this out once and write it down and then consult it during the course of play. Once we figured out the base damage, we can start doing some modifications. So if the group is full 20 people strong, then it does its base damage. If it's at half strength, if it's a 10-person group, then it does half damage. Then double the base damage if that group of creatures is capable of attacking more than once per round. So if these were all high-level fighters with multiple attacks, they would get double damage. And double that damage again, yes, these can stack, if their maximum damage with their weapon is 12 or greater. So lances have a base damage, so the light lances that the cavalry are using have a base damage of 1d6. So at max, on a charge, they could be doing double that damage. Max is 6, double that is 12. Great, we meet the minimum. So the cavalry on their charge will do double their base damage. That also applies to the orcs. They set their spears. Their spears have base damage of d6, halberds have a base damage of d10. Double that if they're set to receive a charge, and they're going to be able to be over 12, so they're going to double their base damage when they're charged.
So I think we're ready then to lay this out.
Okay. So in each round of combat, pair off 2 or more groups, at least one enemy and at least one friendly group, to have a fight that round. Each group rolls 1d8. If you have more than one group, for example, in our scenario, there are more groups of men than there are groups of orcs. This scenario may dictate that you double up. So in our side, we've got 2 groups of men attacking each group of orcs on one side of the field as they come thundering across to cut off this column and try to rescue their prisoners. So each group is going to roll a die. So that's 1d8 for the orcs and then 2 d8s for the men. They roll these dice, and the group that gets the higher total is the winner of that, and they add the difference between the totals to their base damage. So if one group rolls a 7 and the other group rolls a 5, then the winning group increases their base damage by 2 for that round. And this can be modified in a few ways. +1 bonus for magic, +1 bonus if the group is led by a PC or a unique NPC. So Sir Dude and Orcus Porcus as groups are going to roll +1. +2 if the group achieves surprise or an ambush. And then -1 if the enemy has a distinct advantage in terrain. So we rolled for surprise. And unsurprisingly, a column of cavalry in open country in broad daylight was unable to surprise orcs, nor were they surprised by the orcs because they knew they were there. Then we rolled for encounter distance. And as best as we could find, Second edition does not have easy to find rules for determining the encounter range, so we fell back to first edition, which is fine. Second edition is basically first edition with the rough edges polished off. And we rolled 64 and then modified that by a total of -3 for the 3 dice that came up as 3s or 4s because it's open scrub. And that gave us an encounter distance of 12 inches or 120 yards. I said before that all of the normal combat rules apply to skirmishes, that what a skirmish does is present a simplified model for attack and damage to make dice rolls fewer. So the cavalry is still going to have to cross 120 yards to get to the orcs in order to engage them.
Right. So in that time, the orcs will be able to fire crossbows for the one group that has crossbows. And then the other 3 groups that are being charged will be able to set their pole weapon.
Right. Now, because we decided that we wanted to be, total bro SR people, and we're going to run this exactly rules as written, we then looked up mount encumbrance, and we added up the weight of rider and equipment and came up with a figure of 180 pounds, which reduces these light horses from their normal move rate of 24 inches down to 16 inches, which is still enough to close the distance. Then if they're charging, they can move 50% further. That brings them back up to 24 inches by a quirk of math.
Okay, so that brings us to our first combat, I believe,
Yep.
which will be 2 groups of cavalry plus Sir Dude charging the crossbow group of orcs plus their chief Orcus.
Yes. Okay, so the first thing that happens is the crossbowmen get to fire. And there are no excellent rules for this in Birthright itself. It does not handle missile combat in skirmish phase. So an incredibly useful forum thread from RPGNet by Thane of Fife. He said that he ruled that they just did base damage but didn't get to roll a die. And that seems fine to me. So we look at the stats we computed earlier, and the crossbow orcs do 10 base damage if they're being charged, which they are. So the very first thing that happens is that the group of charging human cavalry suffer 10 base damage. That reduces them to, they had 24, they're now at 14. They are now at less than 3/4. They've suffered 25% casualties, so they need to test morale. What's their morale? Well, we looked it up in the monster manual, and we found that ordinary soldiers have a morale of 11. If they're with their leader, which they are, their morale is 12. They've suffered 25% casualties, so that's a -2 penalty. So that means that they need to roll 10 or less on 1d20. So I've got 1d20 here. Would you like me to roll it?
Do it.
All right, so we're going to roll 1d20, and they rolled a 10 or less, so they stand.
All right, excellent. So that means that they'll go ahead and be able to finish out their attack, and that gives us 2 full-size groups.
Oh, it gives us 1 full-size group and 1 half-size because they're 10 plus Sir Dude. So I think it's most reasonable to rule that they do that group does half damage.
Okay.
And the other group does full. But they also get to roll 2d8s. And the orc group does not get to roll any at all because they already took their attack. So they roll a 6 and a 2. The orcs rolled a 0 because they didn't get to roll a die. That means they win. They increase their damage by a total of 8. So they're going to do 8 base damage. Double that because they're charging means 16 damage. Plus 8 more damage for the half-size group. Plus 8 more damage. So 16 and 16 is 32 damage against 20 hit die worth of orcs. So in the first round, in the first combat of the first round, 2 groups of human cavalry run down the orcs and completely obliterate them, even though they lose 10 of their number as well.
Then we're going to be left with a mano-a-mano combat between the Orcus Porcus and Sir Dude, just like last time.
Yep, just like last time, per chainmail rules, we might gently but firmly nudge the players that heroes must seek each other out on the battlefield. So Sir Dude separates from his unit and engages Orcus Porcus in some mano a porco combat, and that leaves 1 full strength group and 1 half strength group available next round.
All right, cool. So then let's go ahead and move down to combat number 2, which is 2 cavalry groups versus 1 group of orcs armed with halberds.
Right. So the situation is exactly the same. They're charging, they're receiving a charge, all the factors we worked on in advance. Aren't we glad we wrote them down? So we look and we see that the men charging are going to do 8 base damage. They're double that to 16, and the halberdiers are going to do 9 hits, double that for being charged. But now we need to roll dice. So we're going to roll 1d8 for the orcs and 2d8s for the men, and we're going to find out who is the winner of that fight. Okay, so the orcs rolled a 6, the men rolled a 6 plus 2, so they win the fight, or they win the dice roll, and they get to add the difference, which is 2 extra hits. So the men immediately deal 16 hits because you only do damage for 1 group engaged in the fight. The contribution of the other groups is represented in the additional dice that they get to roll. They immediately do 8 base damage, which doubles to 16 for their charge, So they do 16 hit dice of damage to the orcs, plus the difference in their die roll, which is 2. So they're going to do 18 hit dice of damage to these orcs, which isn't quite enough to destroy them outright. In return, they're going to receive 9 hits base damage because they were charging, and that's going to get doubled to 18. So they're doing the same amount of damage to each other.
Ouch.
So the orc group gets reduced by 18 hit dice, leaving only 2 poor orcs left. They're going to have to test morale, having lost 50% of their health or better. And so is that first group of cavalry, who also suffered 18 damage.
So 18 hits for both, which leaves us with 2 orcs on one side and 22 cavalry on the other.
Correct.
And so it's going to be time for morale checks.
Yeah, Birthright says do morale checks at the end of the round after you've resolved combat. Okay, so fight 3, second verse, same as the first. 1 die for orcs, 2 dice for men. Let's roll. Okay, wow, the men did a lot better this time. The orcs rolled a 3, the men rolled a total of 9. So that's 6 bonus damage for the men. Their base damage, again, 8. Double that because they're charging, that's 16. They add the difference, which is 6. So they're going to be doing 24 damage. They wipe out the enemy orc formation. But in the process, they're going to lose 18 hit dice from that first unit, which is the 9 base damage that the orcs do if they're receiving a charge, doubled because they can set spears.
So the cavalry does 24 and the orcs do 19?
Correct. Sorry, 18.
18. Oh,
The
yes.
orcs do 18. All right, and then the very last fight is the third one of these. So I'll dice for it now. 1 dice for the orcs, 2 dice for the men. Ooh, the orcs did a lot better this time. They got a 6, but the men got an 8. So they're still the winners, which gives them a bonus damage of 2. So again, they're going to do 8 base, times 2 is 16, plus 2 bonus is 18 hit dice of damage to the orcs. And in return, they're going to receive 18 hit dice worth of damage.
So 18 versus 18. All right. So at the end of the battle, we have 2 groups of orcs that have been completely wiped out, and 2 groups of orcs that have minimal survivors, 2 survivors each.
Yeah, let's test their morale now. So orcs, without the presence of their leader, their morale is 10, and they are making this check at a -4 penalty because they've lost 50% or greater of their forces, so they need to roll 6 or less on a d20. So I'll dice for the first one, 20, they fail. Dice for the second one, 8, they also fail. So at the end, they are broken by the charge, and they disperse, flee in terror, etc.
That was brutal.
So at the end of the round, that leaves Sir Dude and Orcus Porcus engaging in their fights, and we would then sidebar onto them starting next round, and they would get a variable amount of time. Birthright is not clear on how long each round of skirmish combat should take. They do say that each round of war card army combat should be equivalent to 5 normal melee rounds. So we might rule that then a melee round and a skirmish round are the same length, since all other combat rules are the same. And so we would then do a quick fight of Sir Dude versus Orcus Porcus, and then we'd go and resolve the rest of the big fights with the other groups. That leaves us with 3 groups of men who have been reduced to less than a quarter strength. Now, they don't get absorbed into a parent unit. They remain their own thing, but they reduce their base damage by 1/4. I'm sorry, they reduce their base damage by half, and their combat resolution die drops to a d6, and then again to a d4 because they're at less than a quarter of their starting dice. But they still do the same amount of damage. It's just that they're more likely to lose the fight or lose the contest.
That puts us in a situation where right now we need to do the battle of the heroes, and then we have 3 groups of cavalry that need to sweep around and attempt to fight through the remaining 2 units of orcs.
Yeah, so we have 3 full strength units of cav and 2 quarter strength units. Sorry, 3 quarter strength units of cav. So if we leave the fight between Sir Dude and Orcus Porcus, although to be proper, we should be resolving that or making attacks every round until that happens.
Well, I think what we should do is go ahead and resolve the hero battle first while the cavalry are riding around the group of prisoners. So, for instance, looking at the map, Combat 4, the cavalry group there should move around going west and then turn north to charge the Orc Group 5. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so while that is happening, Cavalry Group 3 should also be turning south to charge around the prisoner mob, while Cavalry Group 2, I would imagine, would turn north to go and support Sir Dude if necessary and make their way around. So while those cavalry groups are moving, we'll have time to fight the battle between Sir Dude and Orcus Porcus.
Okay, depending on how long it is, what the actual distances are, yes, because they're going to be limited to their 16-inch move every round until they get within charge range, and then they can charge to attack.
Correct. So we'll make an assumption that at least one round will go by before they can charge. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead. Sir Dude, 4th level. His attack roll will be 12 base with a +1 bonus for being mounted. So he'll need an 11.
All right, so I'll roll for him. He got a 1.
All right, so that's a miss.
But on the other hand,
Well, or are we doing this? Are we going to go ahead and do this with the skirmish rules? Do we resolve it with the skirmish rules, or do we resolve it because he should do 8 hit dice of damage, right?
no, once the two heroes have met, they break off into man-to-man combat and trade blows as normal.
Okay, so then that'll be a miss.
Yeah. Orcus Porcus, on the other hand, is a 3-hit die creature. So his THAC0 is 17. He does +2 damage if he hits. Is 13, so he needs a 13 or better.
Yep.
To hit. And he got a 14, so he hits and does, what's his axe? D8 +2?
Right, D8 +2.
4 +2 is 6 damage to Sir Dude. Okay, and then another, and while that was happening, all of the cavalry was moving. So I remind you that Sir Dude and Orcus Porcus are doing their thing. That still leaves one full-size group and one half-size group who charged the crossbowmen alive and intact. They and the second pair of cavalry groups should wheel around the north end of the column and be prepared to charge the halberdiers, while the other two pairs of groups on the southern end of the column should wheel around the south and be prepared to charge the spearmen.
Right. So I would say that Group 4 should be able to charge Orc Group 5 on this round, and then Cavalry Group 1 should be able to charge Orc Group 6 on this round.
And then next round, the other two cavalry will catch up?
Correct.
Okay. So that's round 2 is Orcus Porcus versus Sir Dude and the movement. Okay, round 3, let's do another Orcus Porcus versus Sir Dude. Sir Dude needs to hit on an 11 or better. Got a 10, that's a miss. Orcus Porcus needs to hit on a 13 or better. Got a 12, that's a miss. All right, now we have one full-size group of humans, so that's a D8, and one half-size group of humans, but not quarter, so that's a D6. So that's what they're going to roll, charging one group of Orcish halberdiers, so they get a D8. Let's roll. Okay, the men do slightly better. They got a 2 and a 3 versus the Orcs 2. So they win the fight by 3. So the full-size group, to back up a step, we should say characters in the world know how to fight. Players don't need to. So we would assume that they would reorganize so that the half-size group is in the back. The full-size group then comes in and charges to do their base damage of 8 times 2 because their charging is 16 plus 3 is 19 because of they won that the contest. And in return, they receive 18 hit dice of damage. So they deal 19, receive 18.
So that leaves one orc who will need to make his morale check.
And on the other hand, we have one group of full strength and one group of quarter strength versus a full strength orc spear. Let's roll. Oh, wow. Okay, it's barely, but they win. They got a 6 and a 2 versus the orc 7. So again, they crash in, they do 8 times 2 is 16, plus the bonus is 1. So they do 17 hit dice of damage, and in return, they receive 18 hit dice of damage.
So I'm sorry. So Orc 6 took in the top battle 6 versus 1. Cavalry 1 took 18 damage. And
Dealt
Orc
19.
Oh, so okay. They took 19.
They dealt 19 and took 18. And in the bottom group,
Right. Cavalry 1 took 18 damage,
yes,
and Orc 6 took 19 damage.
yes,
And then Cavalry 4 takes 18.
yes. Takes 18, deals 17.
All right, so then it's morale check time.
Yes. So I will dice for the Orcish morale. And so again, they're without leader, and they're less than 50%. So they succeed on a 6 or lower. We roll 7. That's a fail. And second group roll 8. That's a fail. So at the end of the third round of combat, all of the orcs have been slain or driven from the field. Now we also need to test the men's morale. Their morale is slightly better. It's 11, but they have suffered. Do we remember to test their morale at the end of last round?
I don't think we did.
The groups that suffer damage have to make their morale checks as well. They're 11 minus 4 is 7. So here we go. 17 fail, 10 fail, and last time 1. Okay, that's a success. And last time 8. That's a fail. So one of those groups, maybe the ones that would have come in on round 4.
So groups 2 and 3 failed. Groups 1 and 4 passed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is fine, because those are the ones that would have been coming in next round anyway, because we had a 1 round delay. So at the end of round 3, we have Orcus Porcus alone on the field with Sir Dude still up, having taken only a total of 6 damage in the fight with him, and a great many horsemen.
Okay, well then we'll leave it at that then.
So at the end of the day, we have all of the orcs driven from the field, slain or fled, and Orcus Porcus alone standing against Sir Dude, and a great many horsemen. I didn't write down all their numbers because I knew you were doing it, but we could figure out how many are alive. So the DM might rule that Orcus Porcus needs to test morale right now to see if he surrenders because he is completely outnumbered, or if he fights to the bitter end.
I would say he needs to test for morale at -4, definitely.
Okay, well his morale is 12 minus 4 puts him at 8. Let's roll for it. Yeah, he rolled an 8, so he spits defiance and declares that he'll fight to the bitter end.
All right, in which case he will get probably mowed down by one group or another of the cavalry as they come to the assistance of Sir
Yes,
Dude.
because within 1 round he's going to receive 20 or more lance charge attacks from the lancers, unless we follow the DMG rule that says that only 2
I would
figures
say
can
only
attack.
2. I would say
Yeah,
only. So yeah, he's toast. But in any case,
weight of numbers, eventually he gets borne down and slain.
all right. So quick commentary versus Conan D20. Easier, harder?
Oh, easier by far.
Yeah,
Uh,
much faster.
because yes, faster to set up, and I don't know how much of that is because we are already ourselves familiar with D&D, so we didn't have to learn another system for how things are managed. It's also faster because it is automatic damage rather than a dice pool of test and defense every round. There's just automatic damage. It seems bloodier. Conan seems like there's more room for skirmishing, for people to kind of get in and get out and to survive, whereas this was a bloody slogfest.
Yeah, definitely. I think Conan 2D20 has a little bit more in terms of tactical flexibility, whereas this one is more about getting the battle resolved. And I definitely believe that it's designed to be done at the table right there in the session so that it can be worked out relatively quickly. I mean, this only took us about 15 minutes, so that's not bad at all.
Yeah, you could definitely handle this at the table, which is how Birthright designed all of its stuff. Everything that Birthright did for their mass combat, this was all 1995, so before the internet was widespread, and they needed to be able to do this quickly, easily, in the flow of play. And I think it worked.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me today. Thanks for going through this. Be sure and hit like and subscribe, folks, so that when the next Birthright video comes out, you can take a peek at that. And go ahead and stay tuned. We will be continuing this series and investigating several more mass combat rule sets as part of the Mastering Mass Combat series. Thanks again, RPG Sage, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Take care.